On a quiet April morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a retired veteran and his German shepherd stepped outside to inspect the damage after a violent thunderstorm. They weren't looking for trouble. They found it bleeding beneath a broken oak branch, a dying mother bobcat, shielding 3 trembling kittens. For 6 days, the man brought water and meat. For 6 days, the dog stood guard between predator and wilderness. Then she disappeared. 6 weeks later, she came back. And what happened that night would leave a fallen tree where a man had been sitting just seconds before. If you believe that loyalty doesn't belong to just one species, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and walk these mountains with us. Late April light filtered through thinning storm clouds over the Blue Ridge, laying pale gold across soaked leaves and splintered branches. The thunder had rolled east before dawn, leaving the forest rinsed clean but unsettled. Water dripped steadily from broken oak limbs. The creek below the ridge ran louder than usual, swollen and restless, striking rock with a low, continuous force. Calder Wind stepped off the porch of his timber cabin just after sunrise, boots sinking slightly into softened earth. He was 64, tall but leaner than he had once been, his shoulders still squared by long discipline. His face was narrow and defined, straight nose, high cheekbones, a short beard streaked in gray. His eyes were pale, deliberate, always measuring before committing. He had spent 22 years as an infantry sergeant. He did not romanticize those years. Combat had taken friends, taken sleep, taken any illusion that hesitation was harmless. What it left him with was instinct sharpened by consequence. Calder did not rush. He did not ignore irregularities. He trusted patterns, and he trusted when something in those patterns felt wrong. The mountains suited him because they did not disguise cause and effect. Bran moved at his side, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a deep sable coat that darkened along his spine and lightened toward his legs. He was large but clean-lined, built for stamina rather than show. His amber eyes carried steady awareness, and a thin scar marked the bridge of his muzzle. Years earlier, Bran had been trained to detect explosives and track human movement in unstable terrain. Even now, retired from conflict, he carried himself like a working dog. His head stayed level, his gait was quiet. He listened to ground and air as if they might shift without warning. The bond between them was not loud or sentimental. It was built from shared survival. They walked the eastern boundary of Calder's 40 wooded acres. Broken limbs lay scattered across the forest floor. Calder paused at exposed roots and lean trunks, assessing angles, weight, and soil stability. One tall pine to the northeast had shifted slightly. The rain had loosened its base. It remained upright, but its hold in the earth was weaker than before. He noted it without comment. Bran moved ahead, nose lowered to damp leaves. Bran slowed abruptly. He did not bark. His body stilled, ears angled forward, nose drawing in air with slow precision. After a moment, he turned and met Calder's gaze. There was no agitation in him, only focus. Calder felt the shift immediately. He stepped off the deer trail and followed. The scent reached him next, metallic, faint, carried thin by the morning air. Blood. They found her beneath a broken white oak limb near the bend of the creek. The branch had fallen during the night's storm, heavy enough to split clean from the trunk. Beneath it lay a bobcat, her tawny coat darkened by rain and mud. A deep tear marked her left shoulder where the limb had struck. The wound was raw, but not fatal. Her breathing was shallow, measured, controlled by pain. 3 kittens were pressed tightly against her belly. They were no more than 5 or 6 weeks old, their fur soft and faintly spotted. One lifted its head toward the morning light, eyes still pale blue with youth. Bran stepped forward once. "Stay," Calder said quietly. Bran lowered at once, positioning himself several yards back, angled to monitor both the creek and the surrounding tree line. His tail rested still against the ground. No growl, no raised fur, only readiness. The mother bobcat opened her eyes halfway. Gold dulled by strain, she bared her teeth in a dry hiss, not loud but clear. Her forepaw shifted instinctively toward her kittens, drawing them closer. Calder crouched slowly, careful to remain beyond her reach. He studied the fallen oak limb, the direction of impact, the placement of her body. She had likely taken shelter there during the storm. The branch had come down without warning. The kittens had survived because she had not moved. Calder recognized that posture. He had seen men do the same, place themselves between danger and those behind them. He unclipped the metal cup from his belt and poured water from his canteen. He set it within reach but outside striking distance, then stepped back. For several long seconds, nothing moved except the creek. Then the bobcat dragged herself forward inch by inch. She drank. One kitten stumbled against her side, pressing closer. Bran's ears flicked at the sound, but he remained steady, eyes scanning outward. Calder felt the familiar calculation rise inside him. He could walk away. The forest had its own order. The storm had been chance, not cruelty. No one would question him for leaving nature to itself, but he knew too well what it meant to stand still when action was possible. He stood and returned to the cabin, coming back with strips of dried venison. He placed them where scent would carry without forcing proximity. He did not attempt to clean the wound, not yet. Survival required patience more than control. Calder moved uphill with Bran to a rocky rise that allowed distance without abandonment. They watched. The mother bobcat ate small pieces of meat. The bleeding slowed as clotting thickened. The kittens shifted and nudged her flank, reassured by warmth more than strength. A distant coyote call echoed across the ridge. Bran stood instantly, body aligned toward the sound, silent and firm. The bobcat lifted her head, despite the injury, placing her body subtly between the direction of the call and her young. Calder exhaled slowly. 6 days, he said, not as promise, but structure. He would bring water. He would bring food. Enough time for her body to stabilize. Nothing beyond that. The light warmed toward midday. The forest resumed its rhythm, woodpecker tapping, wind moving through branches, water threading over stone. The mother bobcat lay back down, her kittens pressed against her side. Her eyes did not close fully now. They followed movement, not trusting, but no longer fading. Calder rose without hesitation. Bran stood beside him, casting one final measured glance toward the hollow. They walked back toward the cabin through damp leaves and clearing sky, leaving behind a wounded predator and 3 fragile lives balanced between endurance and loss. Tomorrow would begin the count. By the second day, the hollow no longer felt like the aftermath of a storm. It felt like a held breath. The ground remained damp, the creek still swollen, but the violence of the night had passed into something quieter, something watchful. Calder did not announce his presence when he approached. He walked the same measured path, boots finding the firmer patches of soil, eyes scanning before each step. Bran moved slightly ahead, adjusting to the wind without instruction, his head lifting once, then lowering again as he tested the air. The bobcat was awake before they came fully into view. Her gold eyes tracked them through the broken lattice of branches. The wound along her shoulder had darkened where blood had clotted. The swelling remained, but the raw shine of exposed tissue had dulled. The kittens pressed against her side, thin ribs rising quickly beneath soft fur. Calder placed the water cup at the same distance as before and laid fresh strips of venison beyond her reach, but within scent. He withdrew without turning abruptly, giving her the space of a wary equal rather than a rescuer. Bran settled downwind, angled so the current of air crossed his muzzle first. His posture communicated neither dominance nor curiosity. It was the posture of perimeter. Years earlier, in unstable terrain far from these mountains, he had been trained to read soil displacement and hidden charges. That discipline remained in the way he listened, not for sound alone, but for absence of it. Calder trusted that silence in him. On the 3rd day, movement broke the pattern. A lean coyote stepped from the tree line across the creek, its coat patchy from seasonal shed. It was young, likely pushed from a pack during spring dispersal, and hunger had narrowed its caution. It circled wide, gauging distance. Bran did not bark. He rose and squared his stance, chest forward, tail level, gaze fixed but controlled. The message was clear. Not here. The coyote hesitated, then veered away, melting back between trunks. Calder did not praise the dog. No words were necessary. The hollow remained balanced because Bran had chosen restraint over chase. By the fourth day, the wound began to seal more cleanly. The angry redness along the edges had faded, replaced by darker scabbing that held without fresh seepage. Calder carried a strip of cloth lightly dampened with diluted antiseptic and left it on a nearby rock where insects tended to gather. He did not touch her. Contact would have broken the fragile agreement forming between distance and survival. The bobcat watched him with steady calculation, no longer flinching at every shift of his weight. Trust was not the word for it. Recognition was closer. The kittens grew bolder as strength returned to their mother. One ventured a few feet toward the edge of the fallen limb, batting clumsily at a curl of bark. Its balance wavered, hind legs uncertain on slick mud. Bran observed the small movement without tension. His ears flicked once, then settled. He understood scale. Predator or not, the kitten was not threat. Calder noted the difference in the dog's breathing, slow, regulated. Bran had learned to calibrate response rather than react to instinct. Midweek, Martin Hale's pickup rolled along the distant gravel road that bordered the far end of Calder's acreage. Martin was 58, broad through the chest from decades of handling chainsaws and timber. His thick brown mustache, now threaded with gray, framed a mouth more accustomed to silence than storytelling. He had lost a younger brother to a logging accident years ago, a misjudged fall that crushed more than bone. Since then, Martin looked at trees differently, measuring lean and root spread as if reading warning signs in scripture. He stopped by the fence line that afternoon, leaning one forearm across a post. His eyes moved across the slope before settling on the northeast ridge. "That pine shifted," he said simply. "Ground soft, might not hold next time." Calder followed his gaze without responding immediately. He had already marked it in memory. The slight lean, the exposed roots. "I'll keep an eye on it," he answered. Martin nodded once and drove on. He did not ask about the creek bend, though his glance had lingered there a second longer than necessary. On the fifth day, the bobcat attempted to rise fully. The first attempt failed. Her injured shoulder buckled under weight. The second held. She stood for several breaths, spine arched slightly as she balanced against pain. The kittens adjusted around her, weaving between her legs in instinctive coordination. Calder did not move closer. He measured her posture instead. Her breathing was deeper now, less shallow. Recovery had begun to move from fragile to viable. The forest pressed in around them with its ordinary sounds, woodpecker strikes against hollow trunk, wind moving through higher canopy, water threading over stone. Nothing extraordinary announced itself. Survival rarely did. Bran remained downwind, scanning the ridgeline where the coyote had appeared days earlier. His body language had softened slightly. Vigilance remained, but tension had eased. He was not guarding a casualty anymore. He was guarding time. On the sixth morning, sunlight broke clean across the hollow, filtering through branches that had once shielded the ground in shadow. Calder approached with the same measured pace, water and meat prepared. He sensed the shift before he saw it. The bobcat stood without faltering. Her weight rested cautiously on the injured shoulder, but it held. The wound had dried along its edges, the swelling reduced to manageable stiffness. She did not bare her teeth. She held his gaze for a full breath. In that moment, Calder recognized the change. She was no longer surviving minute to minute. She was assessing distance. The kittens moved with more confidence, exploring a wider arc before returning to her flank. Bran rose beside Calder, posture neutral, neither advancing nor retreating. The balance had shifted from emergency to transition. Calder set down the water and stepped back as he had each day. He felt no surge of victory, only completion of a structure he had imposed on himself. 6 days. Water, food, space. Nothing more. He would return again tomorrow, but the count was no longer about stabilization. It was about departure. The wind moved lightly through the trees, carrying clean scent rather than blood. The hollow did not feel held anymore. It felt temporary. Calder turned uphill, Bran falling into step at his side. Neither looked back immediately. Behind them, the bobcat adjusted her stance and gathered her kittens closer, not from fear, but from readiness. 6 days had been enough. On the seventh morning, the hollow stood open and unoccupied. The fallen white oak limb still rested across damp soil, but the space beneath it held no fur, no breath, no watchful gold eyes. Mud near the creek bend showed shallow drag marks where weight had shifted and risen. 4 sets of tracks pressed northward, one larger and steady, 3 smaller, clustered close. The ground carried no blood, only direction. Calder did not step into the clearing at once. He remained at its edge, reading what remained. The mother had moved them before sunrise, during the quietest hour when wind stays low and birds have not yet broken the air with noise. He crouched briefly to study the impressions. The larger stride was longer than it had been days earlier. Weight distributed evenly. The injured shoulder had held under load. That was enough. Bran lowered his nose to the soil and followed the tracks a short distance into the tree line. His breathing shifted into focused rhythm, then steadied again. No sharp trace of fear lingered, no burst pattern suggesting flight. After a few yards, he paused and looked back toward Calder. Not eager, not tense, simply confirming. Calder gave a small nod. That's enough. They did not pursue. In another season of his life, he might have followed further, mapping terrain out of habit. Years had narrowed that instinct. Assistance did not grant ownership. The Bobcat had regained the ability to choose direction. Following her now would turn discipline into intrusion. They walked back toward the cabin through drying leaves and filtered light. The forest had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Woodpeckers tapped. Water moved over stone. The hollow no longer felt fragile. It felt reclaimed. At the cabin, Calder split a short stack of wood beneath the overhang, while Bran rested nearby, chin low but ears responsive. Beyond the northeast ridge, the tall pine Martin had mentioned remained in view. Its lean was subtle, but the soil around its base still showed signs of lift from the saturated ground. Calder studied it longer than he had the previous day. Storm cycles loosened roots gradually. Failure rarely announced itself loudly beforehand. Later that afternoon, a compact silver SUV slowed near the lower fence. From it stepped a woman in her early 40s, tall and narrow-framed, auburn hair secured in a loose knot at the back of her head. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Price, a wildlife biologist overseeing predator corridor studies across several miles of Blue Ridge terrain. Her skin carried sun freckles across the bridge of her nose, evidence of field seasons rather than offices. She moved with measured efficiency, neither hurried nor hesitant. She had contacted Calder weeks earlier about placing non-invasive trail cameras along a shared ridgeline. The storm had given her reason to check equipment. She noticed Bran first. Her gaze paused on the thin scar across his muzzle. "Working background?" she asked, voice even. "Explosive detection," Calder answered. She nodded once, respectful without dramatizing it. "He holds space well." "He reads it better than most people," Calder replied. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the creek bend. "Movement through here changed," she said, not as accusation, but observation. "They left at dawn," Calder answered. She absorbed that without further inquiry. "That's the outcome we hope for," she said. "Independence restored." They walked a short distance along the fence line, discussing camera placements and recent predator dispersal patterns. Eleanor spoke without sentiment. Injuries from falling limbs were common in heavy weather years. Survival rates improved sharply when weight-bearing resumed within a week. Her tone remained analytical, but not detached from consequence. Before returning to her vehicle, she glanced once toward the ridge. "Ground's still soft," she said quietly. "Storm cycles haven't finished." Calder followed her line of sight to the pine. He did not respond. When her vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, the property returned to its usual stillness. Evening settled without spectacle. Calder ate on the porch steps while Bran sat beside him, posture relaxed but not careless. The pine caught the last band of light, its lean unchanged but more apparent once seen. After sunset, Bran walked the yard's perimeter once, nose testing currents, then lay down near the porch, his breathing leveled. Calder walked halfway toward the creek bend before stopping. The tracks had already begun to soften along their edges as drying mud contracted. He felt no absence pressing at him, only confirmation. A living creature had endured because help arrived before collapse. The forest required no acknowledgement beyond that. By morning, wind would scatter loose debris across the impressions. Within days, rain would erase them entirely. Calder turned back toward the cabin. Bran followed without command. The hollow had resumed its own terms. May gave way to early June, without spectacle. The storm that had broken branches and lifted roots in late April receded into background memory, replaced by warmer air and the steady hum of insects rising from damp soil. The creek thinned back into its usual channel. New leaves filled gaps where limbs had snapped. The land appeared settled. Calder Wynn returned to maintenance. He repaired the porch overhang, where wind had loosened 2 boards, replacing old nails with longer exterior screws and bracing the support beam with a salvaged steel bracket. His movements were precise, economical. He measured before drilling, checked alignment before tightening. Prevention required less force than correction. At 64, he no longer moved quickly, but he moved deliberately. Years in uniform had not left him reckless. They had left him exact. He finished what he began. He did not ignore small instabilities. Bran remained close through most of the work. The 5-year-old German Shepherd carried a deep sable coat that caught late spring light along his spine. His amber eyes tracked more than motion. They tracked pattern. When Calder climbed the ladder, Bran positioned himself at the base without instruction, head lifted, ears shifting between tree line and handler, not anxious, simply covering space. By late May, Calder began clearing thinner trees along the eastern boundary, where soil still held excess moisture. He used a handsaw rather than a chainsaw for control. Each cut was followed by a pause, a calculation of weight and fall line. He stacked usable wood beneath the overhang and dragged brush toward the lower fence. The work was steady. The land responded. The tall pine on the northeast ridge remained. It stood slightly apart from the hardwoods, its trunk straight but its root plate subtly lifted on one side, where April's storm had saturated the ground. The lean was modest, barely noticeable unless studied, but persistent. Calder had marked it the day Martin Hale mentioned it. Removing it now, while soil still held moisture, risked unpredictable movement. Waiting allowed tension to settle or declare itself. He adjusted nothing yet. Bran occasionally paused near the yard's edge and looked upward along the trunk. He did not bark or circle. He stood still, posture aligned, head angled as if listening through the wood itself. Once, seconds before any audible sound reached human range, the pine emitted a faint internal crackle as fibers shifted under load. Calder heard it then. He began mapping potential fall trajectories in his mind. If the pine released along its current lean, its crown would arc toward the eastern corner of the porch roof. Not direct impact, unless wind added force. In early June, Martin Hale returned near dusk. He stepped from his pickup with the deliberate heaviness of a man who had handled timber most of his life. Broad-shouldered, forearms thick, mustache now more gray than brown, Martin carried the habit of reading trees as if they were machinery under strain. Years earlier, a misjudged fall had taken his younger brother. Since then, Martin did not trust leaning trunks. They walked together toward the pine. Martin circled once, boot pressing lightly at the soil near the exposed roots. He tilted his head, studying the crown line. "She's holding," he said, "but she's storing." Calder understood. "I'll take her when the ground firms another inch," he replied. Martin nodded. He did not argue with measured timing. Mid-month, Dr. Eleanor Price returned to check trail camera placements along the ridge. Tall, narrow-framed, auburn hair secured back from her face, she moved with field season efficiency. Her sun-freckled skin and steady gaze reflected long days outdoors rather than laboratory walls. She offered updates on regional predator movement, young dispersals widening territory as summer approached. She paused near the yard when Bran approached with quiet neutrality. Her eyes noted the thin scar across his muzzle. "He calibrates well," she observed. "He wastes nothing," Calder replied. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the ridgeline. "Root systems take longer to stabilize than canopy," she said. "Storm years can surprise people." Calder followed her line of sight to the pine, but gave no answer. When she left, the property returned to stillness. Wind patterns shifted as June deepened. Afternoon gusts began arriving from the west, pressing across the ridge rather than through it. The pine absorbed the force differently now. Its movement was subtle, less sway, more resistance. 6 weeks passed without incident. The vegetable rows pushed green through dark soil. The porch reinforcement held. The fallen oak limb near the creek began to gray along its exposed wood. The land appeared settled. On a warm evening near the end of the 6th week, Calder stood at the yard's edge while Bran rested beside him. Low light struck the pine at an angle that made the slight lift of its root plate more visible than before. Bran rose without command and took 3 steps forward, eyes fixed upward. The wind had not yet reached them. Calder followed the dog's gaze. The pine did not move, but it was not at rest. 6 weeks had passed. The land appeared settled. The pine disagreed. By the last week of June, the air carried weight. Heat gathered low along the ridgeline and pressed downward into the clearing, flattening birdsong and slowing even the insects. The sky dulled from blue into a muted gray that suggested movement building rather than arrival. It was not a large storm system, only a late afternoon squall, the kind that brought wind before rain and left branches unsettled. Calder wind had been splitting wood beneath the overhang when the first gust moved across the ridge. The blow came dry and fast, bending grasses flat before releasing them. The pine on the northeast rise answered with a low internal strain, less sway than resistance. Bran rose immediately. His ears lifted and rotated, tracking direction. He stepped off the porch and advanced 3 measured paces toward the yard's edge. Body aligned, eyes fixed beyond the leaning pine toward the darker tree line. Calder set the maul upright in the block and followed the dog's gaze. Another gust pressed harder, carrying dust ahead of rain. Movement separated from shadow. The mother bobcat stepped from cover at the far edge of the clearing. Her coat had thickened since spring. The pale scar across her shoulder showed faintly beneath tawny fur. She did not approach the cabin. She moved laterally along the tree line near the base of the pine, controlled and fluid, ears angled up slope. She paused. A short clipped sound left her throat. Brief, contained, not prolonged, not aggressive. Bran answered with a single bark, measured, not pursuit. The bobcat shifted position again, placing distance between herself and the trunk, then continued across the clearing toward thicker brush. Before disappearing, she turned her head once, not toward Calder, but toward the ridge above. The wind strengthened. The pine responded differently now. The sound was deeper, fiber tension adjusting under uneven load. Soil along the lifted root plate began to fracture. Calder stepped forward into the yard. Bran held position beside him, no longer focused on the cat, but on the trunk. The next gust struck with sustained force. The pine did not snap mid-trunk. It uprooted. The root plate tore free from saturated ground with a grinding surge as earth split away. The trunk descended in a heavy arc toward the eastern corner of the porch. The reinforced beam absorbed a part of the force. Steel bent, but held long enough to deflect the crown. Shingles shattered. The outer overhang collapsed inward. The main cabin wall remained intact. Rain followed seconds later. Calder and Bran stood near the truck at the far side of the yard, protected by angle and distance. Branches thrashed once more against siding before settling. Silence returned gradually beneath rain. Calder waited several breaths before moving. Bran remained forward-leaning but steady, scanning for secondary failure. The pine lay partially across the yard, its trunk resting against the damaged corner of the porch. The reinforcement installed weeks earlier had redirected the worst of the fall. Calder stepped closer, placing a hand against wet bark. Residual vibration faded under his palm. Beyond the clearing, no further movement showed along the tree line. Rain darkened the exposed roots and flattened dust into mud. The squall moved east within the hour. Calder secured a tarp over the broken edge of the overhang while light remained. Bran stayed near, posture attentive but calm, adjusting to the altered shape of the yard. When night settled, the air cooled. Calder stood once at the edge of the clearing and looked at the pine now horizontal against the earth. The tension that had built for weeks had resolved in seconds. Wind moved lightly through remaining branches. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something traveled through undergrowth. Unhurried, steady. Calder did not call out. Bran remained beside him. The storm had been brief. The ground had decided. Morning arrived clear and thinner after the squall. The pine already lay across the yard where it had fallen the evening before, its root plate lifted and exposed like a broken hinge. What had once been vertical risk now rested horizontal, heavy, but still. Calder stepped onto the porch with coffee in one hand, studying the damage in silence. The reinforced beam had bent under impact, yet held enough to redirect the trunk away from the cabin wall. The eastern corner of the overhang remained compromised but standing. The crushed wooden chair beneath scattered branches marked the exact position where he often sat at dusk. Bran moved along the fallen trunk with measured attention. His 5-year-old frame carried no visible tension, but his ears remained active, rotating independently as wind brushed through needles. He paused near the torn root plate and angled his head, listening to something too small to be called sound. The air shifted. It was subtle, no gust, no visible sway. Only a faint internal adjustment from within the wood fibers, still under uneven compression. Bran reacted first. He stepped quickly to Calder's side and gripped the hem of the man's shirt near the waist. The hold was firm, practiced, deliberate. Calder felt the pull and stepped back without hesitation. A sharp crack followed. Not from above, but from the earth. The root plate shifted further upward as saturated soil compacted under redistributed weight. The trunk slid several inches along the tarp-covered edge of the porch and dropped with a heavy settling impact. A secondary limb snapped downward exactly where the chair had stood, splintering the remaining fragments into smaller debris. Dust lifted briefly before rainwater-darkened soil absorbed it. Then, stillness. The pine did not fall again. It finished settling. Bran released the fabric and moved forward cautiously, confirming stability. His breathing slowed once the strain within the wood ceased. Calder surveyed the yard, measuring angles and consequences. The cabin wall remained untouched. The reinforced beam had fractured along one edge, but had prevented full structural penetration. The difference between damage and collapse had been inches. He retrieved a handsaw and began removing smaller branches from the outer edge of the trunk to reduce stress on the damaged overhang. Each cut released fresh resin scent into the warming air. The fallen pine no longer carried threat, only weight. Mid-morning, a white utility van pulled to a stop along the gravel boundary. Thomas Reed stepped out, lean and angular, his dark beard trimmed close against a jaw set in habitual concentration. A roofing accident years earlier had left his left wrist slightly misaligned. Since then, he inspected structural damage with relentless caution. He measured beams by instinct before tools. Thomas examined the porch corner, tracing the bend in the steel bracket with a steady finger. It absorbed the vector, he said. If that bracket wasn't there, your interior frame would be split. Calder nodded. Thomas glanced toward Bran. He pulled you back? Yes. Good dog. They discussed replacement timber and the sequence required to detach the main trunk safely. The assessment was straightforward, repairable, contained. By afternoon, the smaller debris had been cleared and stacked. The broken chair had been removed. The pine lay fully grounded, no residual strain audible within its fibers. Calder stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the empty space where the chair had once rested. No miracle had intervened. The tree had been weakened since April. Soil had shifted. Wind had completed the process. A trained dog had reacted before physics accelerated. That was all. Bran came to stand beside him, posture relaxed now, tail low and neutral. The yard had changed shape, but it had stabilized. The pine would be cut into sections over the next few days. The porch would be rebuilt. The root cavity would fill gradually with rain and fallen leaves. What had leaned had fallen. What had stood had held. Calder turned back toward the cabin. Bran followed without command. The tree did not fall because of fate, and the cabin did not stand because of magic. Roots had weakened slowly. Reinforcement had been placed deliberately. 2 quiet steps backward made the difference between impact and survival. Life often works this way. No thunderous warning, only subtle shifts, small sounds, and the steady presence of someone who senses change before we do. Strength is rarely dramatic. It is prepared. It is watchful. It is shared in silence. Perhaps grace does not always arrive as spectacle. Sometimes it arrives as awareness, as instinct, as the right presence beside us at the right moment. If this story reminded you of a time when a small warning changed everything, share it. Leave a comment about the moment you almost missed. Subscribe for more stories of endurance and quiet courage. And may God bless your home with steadiness, your mind with discernment, and your life with protection, seen and unseen.